it's a special pleasure to welcome this evening's speaker, the American novelist Josi S. Kilpack. Josi has written some 25 novels to date, including a 12-book series intriguingly categorised as culinary mysteries, as well as one more straightforward cookbook. That is right.
Yes.
More recently, she's turned to historical romance, and it was one of these titles, The Lady of the Lakes, with its strong echoing of Scott's most famous poem, that first drew the club's attention to her as a must-get speaker. On the other hand, Josi hails from the state of Utah on the far side for us, that is, of the USA, where she has a family of 4 children and is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it seemed that as twain were never likely to meet. Apprised that Josi might be over here this autumn, Lee Simpson, as our Events Convenor, nevertheless pounced, and with her generous agreement and a slight rejigging of our programme, I'm delighted to announce that we've procured our goal. First published in March last year, The Lady of the Lakes is indeed about Walter Scott, focusing on 2 crucial romances in his mid-20s, his courtship of the heiress Wilhemina, which took him on at least one unavailing visit to her family home in Fettercairn in Kincardineshire, just south of Aberdeen, and his more successful pursuit of Charlotte Carpenter, born Charpentier, then a ward of the Marquis of Downshire. Was it Downshire or Downton?
I think it was Downshire.
Downton, that's a slip of the fingers there, of Downton, quickly corrected mind, which was mainly played out in the setting of Gillsland, a spa resort in Cumberland, close to the Roman wall. There's a sort of common understanding that Scott's apparent rejection by Wilhemina in favour of a more socially advantageous suitor led to a kind of rebound match with Charlotte less than a year later. But The Lady of the Lakes depicts a more complex pattern than this. Having just returned from Gillsland myself, almost exactly 220 years since Scott was there with Charlotte, I can hardly think of a better situation for Scott's adventurous, yet at the same time innately practical side to find expression. Josi's work also mirrors Scott in skillfully blending known facts, imaginative projections based on probability, and the odd moment of artistic license. And no doubt she'll want to talk about this aspect of her writing too. There's clearly much to discuss, so without any more delay, over to our speaker, Josi Kilpack, on the subject of writing, the title has changed slightly, so I'll go with the one on the board, Writing Walter and Charlotte's Love Story. Josi.
Well, I thank you guys very much for being here. It's really a privilege and an honor. I have never been to Scotland before. I visited England about 15 years ago, but I only stayed in London, so I've been told that doesn't really count. So I'm excited to be here and to share with you guys the process of my writing this book. Before we get started, there's a couple disclaimers that I want you guys to understand. I grew up in a small town, well, relatively small compared to a lot of the UK, and Sir Walter obviously was a Scotsman, so we grew up very, very different. So I'm certain that there are things within the Scottish context that is not spot on. So understand that. It was very tricky to balance out the true events and the fictional events. I did include at the back of my book chapter notes. I was pretty anxious about this aspect of writing the book because I didn't want anyone to feel like I had taken too much liberty. So I tried really hard to do my homework and to get the things right, but there is a certain level of manipulation, I guess, of timelines and things in order for me to put the book into a story form, to follow the traditional story arc. And I am a storyteller. Sir Walter was a historian. Many of you are probably historians. I am not. I am a storyteller. Chiefly that is what I do. And so I researched the parts of Sir Walter's life that were necessary for me to write this story, but I am by no means a historian. And I'm hoping to go through this and then have some time for question and answer, but if there's something that you want to you want answered as we go, feel free to raise your hand, and I will do my best. So when I wrote this book, as Peter said, I have been publishing for nearly 20 years. I've written a large variety of novels. Most of my novels have been contemporary, and they're set in the States. My early books were faith-based within the parameters of my religion, and my publisher is a faith-based publisher. They publish both within the regional area that I'm at, which has the highest concentration of members of my church, but they also have a national arm which they publish beyond that. And I started writing historical fiction, and I'd written a couple of Regency romances, and my publisher approached me with the idea of writing true romance. And so they wanted me to find some literary characters, specifically, that had a romantic story, a love story worth telling. So because my publisher is religiously based, we had some parameters that they gave me on finding the candidates for these stories. First one is it had to be they wanted a literary figure of some kind. They needed to have a happy marriage, and there needed to be a faithful marriage involved. They needed a kind of a conservative character. They wanted someone who lived a life of upper level morality, but they wanted a love story that had some conflict. It needed to be a story that was worth telling, that had some troubles to overcome. So this was kind of my short list of the people that I made lists of. And you can see that many of them were taken out. Now, Elizabeth and Robert Browning, they actually have a lovely love story, but there's another author who does similar books as this. Her name is Nancy Mosier, and she had just written theirs about a year and a half before I started this, and so I decided not to copy that. The rest of them, for one reason or another, didn't reflect what we were looking to do. Those that are left on the list, some of them I have done. I have written Henry Longfellow's. That was my first one. That's the cover that's focused here. He was an early American poet. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, that one has just come out in the last few weeks. She's an American novelist that was credited with part of why our Civil War for civil rights came about. And then on my short list, I had run into an article about John and Sophia Lockhart. And what I had read was that Sir Walter Scott's daughter, Sophia, had married his biographer. And I made a little note of this early on when I was coming up with storylines to tell, and I thought, well, I bet that was a little scandalous. I bet that he had this biographer working on his book, and the biographer fell in love with his daughter, and she's probably 20 years younger than the biographer was, and it was this super scandalous love story. So after I'd finished my first book, I went back and I looked up the story on this, and I thought, well, that might be one that, because they had a happy marriage, and I just found some little details. I hadn't really spent any time, because if I'd spent much time on it, I would have realized that it was just fine, that he became the biographer later on after he had already married Sophia, and he had approval from her father, and so there was no story there. However, in the process, I discovered this specific article. This was kind of the beginning. Now, I'd read, some Wikipedia and some little details here and there, but this document, which is part of the University of Edinburgh's collection, specifically talked about his relationship with Wilhemina, and then it went on in the second page, it talks about Charlotte, but probably 2/3 of this article is about Wilhemina. And then there's this little couple paragraphs at the end about Charlotte, but this was the first thing that I had read that gave a little more details into it. Wikipedia and all these other places have, that he'd been in love with Wilhemina and then he married Charlotte, and all of them, as Peter said, make it sound as though she was kind of a second choice for him. So then my next step is to look into their marriage and read about how were they towards the end of their marriage, how was their relationship. And the things that he said about her were very kind and very sweet, and it sounded to me as though they had had a pretty happy marriage, which in my mind says that she could not have been his second choice. There must be reasons on why it came together this way. So from that point on, I worked on putting a book together, but this quote, which I found in that article, and which I noticed just flipping through, it's in here, became kind of the basis of, and I'm sorry, my font is off, but scarce one person out of 20 marries his first love, and scarce 1 out of 20 of the remainder has cause to rejoice in having done so. What we love in these early years, early days, is generally rather a fanciful creature of our own than a reality. We build statues of snow and weep when they melt. And I thought that was great. It's funny, and I think it has a lot to say towards the relationship that he and Charlotte had, and also the relationship that he and Wilhemina had. These were the primary biographies that I used. The way that I do my writing, again, I'm not a historian, so I don't look into every bit in detail. I find that if I get too much research, then it all starts to contradict each other, or things like that. So these were the ones that I did. I did get the biography written by John Lockhart, and I will have to admit that it was hard for me to get through. I had a difficult time following the information, and in my mind it kind of jumped around a little bit. It didn't follow a perfect chronology, which is what I was looking for. I was looking for things happening in the order that they had happened. And so these were the 3 that I found through source lists on some of the articles that I had discovered. And they are here. I buy my books on Amazon, and I buy them used because I will make a mess of them. So these are the 3 that I used, and these are the notes that I have, and I highlight and I write in the margins and I reference back and forth. And I find that having 3 primary sources, these are all, they're well reputed. And I was able, by having 3 opinions on a thing, it feels like I can get to the meat of it. I can figure out what's right, because every biographer goes in with a bias. And when you read multiple biographies, you can get a better sense of what the bias is that historian has gone into. One of those, and I can't remember which one off the top of my head, but one of those throughout the whole book had just this underlying bias of that Charlotte had been not only his second choice, but kind of a poor choice. And so there were just little undertones throughout the book that, you know, if he'd married Wilhemina, that things would have gone better for him. And of course, I didn't love that. But he had really great chronology, and he followed other things very closely. So these were the works that I primarily used. And I went through and I read up on it, and I make my markings, my post-it notes. I read each one, and I make notes so that I can match up the information back and forth. And I specifically am looking for the details of his childhood that kind of shaped the man he was, and the significant events that happened within the period of time that I'm looking at. So I'm writing from about the time he's about 19 years old until he's about 25, 26 years old. And so I'm looking specifically for the actual events that happened at that time. And often one book would have an event, and then another book wouldn't mention that event, or one would have, you know, a longer explanation of the event, but the other event would mention a detail like the name of the road or the name of the hotel. And so I found it's kind of like reading the 4 Gospels, I guess, in the Bible, that by reading all 4, you get a fuller picture of what is taking place. And so here's the main players in the book. Obviously, Walter Scott and Wilhemina. She is introduced in the very first chapter. And then we have Charlotte, and then we have William Forbes, who ends up being the man that Wilhemina marries, and was also a friend of Walter Scott's. They served in the cavalry together. So those were the 4 stories I was mostly focused on, really just 3 stories. And so I had to get a sense of each one of them, so I spent some time looking into Wilhemina Belsius. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but she transitioned to the name of Stuart because her father had inherited a different title between the time that they met and the time that they broke up, I guess. And so that was confusing. She has 2 different names, and her dad has 2 different titles, and in different books they were used differently. In one book she was Wilhemina Belsius throughout the whole thing, and in another book she was Wilhemina Stuart through the whole thing, and her dad was referred to as different titles, and so it got a little complicated. Also in the book, I call her Mina in the book, which nobody called her that in real life. But one of the things I found in all three of the true romances that I've read is there's always one name that is used by multiple people in a book. And in this one we had William Forbes, we had Wilhemina, we had 2 friends I think that were named William. And in fiction you move that around. You're very careful about not using names that sound too similar because you don't want your reader to get confused, but this wasn't fiction, so I had to mix things up a little bit. And so I called her Mina so that we would make sure we didn't get her confused with anybody else. So the first thing I did is I went through these and I tried to come up with a timeline. So I tried to come up with the significant events that I would then, kind of as a skeleton, those would be my main bones, and that I'm going to build on, and that are going to match up with points that we look for in a fictional novel. So the first thing was that Walter and Wilhemina meet in September 1791. My sources all agreed with that they had met at church, Greyfriars Kirk, and she was wearing a green mantle, and that's used later in his works. So that's important. Anytime you do a romance, you have to have the meeting, and this was when they met, and he was, in my opinion, an extraordinarily romantic man, and he claims to have fallen in love right then. She was 15 years old. Some sources said she was 14 years old, but from what I could figure out, I think she was 15 years old. And he was 19 years old. He was I don't think he was quite yet in school yet to become a barrister, but he was apprenticing with his father at that time. And part of that it was interesting is that was not his church. He didn't attend Greyfriars Kirk. That wasn't his chapel. I believe he went to St. Andrews, but I'm not certain on that. So we have no idea why he was at Greyfriars that day. So I made up that he'd gone with a friend of his who lived closer to that area. I even had emailed the current, I'm not going to get the name right, the current pastor of Greyfriars, and he's the one that told me that there's actually 2 Greyfriars, and an old and a new, I guess, and he wasn't entirely sure how they determined the congregations at that time. I wanted to know who was the pastor at that time, and he said he didn't know because we didn't know which Greyfriars he was in, so that was a little confusing. It makes me feel better about making stuff up when I can't find out the truth. So that was a significant event. And then the next significant event is that Wilhemina is engaged to William Forbes in October of 1796. So 5 years of Sir Walter, Walter at the time, believing that he's going to marry this woman and believing that the class distinctions are not going to get in their way. He was common born, middle class, and she was the only child of a duly titled, I can't remember but they were very different circumstances of their lives. And in October of 1796 is when Walter learns that she is engaged to William. A year after that, Walter meets Charlotte. And you said it better than I say it, Gilson?
Gilsland.
Gilsland.
I'm just
okay.
making it up.
Well, that makes me feel better too.
Yeah.
So, in Gilsland, northern England, he meets Charlotte, and they get married in December of that same year. So very, very short courtship. So we have 5 years of him being madly in love with Wilhemina, and we have 3 months of him courting Charlotte and marrying her. And during that time, they were engaged within a few weeks of having met. And so those were the biggest facts that I had to work with for my storyline. But of course that's not, I needed to fill in those blanks. So I went back again and I looked for what I called secondary points of time. So these are my primary points of time that I focused on for my story. And then I needed to look at the secondary points of time. So my secondary points of time, so here's our 4 points that we went over. And so then I had to find the other things, but I really worked hard to get actual things to the best of my knowledge that happened. So the first significant was that and there should be an accent on that first U in burger, but I couldn't figure out how to do that on my computer. So the Burger translation of the German poem was Walter's first published work that was available for sale, as far as I could find. And the dates on that differ wildly. Some said it was 1793, some said it was 1797, but it seemed like 1795, 1796 was probably the date of that. And so that is significant because Walter Scott is Walter Scott, and that was the first publication that he did. He also, from my understanding, did that without the support of his parents, his father specifically. He thought that he needed his son to focus on an occupation, profession, not his pen. But translations at that time were a really big deal. I found that when I was researching my other book, Set in America, with Henry Longfellow. Translations were the way that a lot of early writers got their start, is they would take a popular poem in another language and they would translate it into a new language, therefore allowing themselves to, I guess, a little bit ride on the coattails of those prior writers and get their start. And so that seemed like a significant point in the story. Walter and Wilhemina, they did not see each other a great deal. She had a family holding in Fettercarn, and there was another holding up that direction too, but very far away from Edinburgh. They would typically come down in the summer months and enjoy the winter months and enjoy the better climate and the society of Edinburgh. But she was gone for a great deal of the time up north. But so we have that there was in the biographies that they reconnected in winter of 1795 or 96. Some people said it was November, somebody else said it was February. I went with the earlier, I went with it being November, figuring that she would have to come down before all the snows made travel difficult, and that their first meeting he'd be very excited to see her. And so I went with that. And that's where the story that I wrote really starts. So we have a first chapter of Walter and Wilhemina meeting at church, and then the next chapter is Walter waiting for Wilhemina to arrive at a ball where he hasn't seen her for several months. They exchanged letters, they saw each other when she was around, but it was never that often. She moved in very different social circles than he did. But Edinburgh at that time was relaxed. It wasn't quite like England was at the time, which was extremely kind of segregated by class, but they still moved a little differently. So we know that Walter visits Fettercarn in spring of 96. The details that I picked up through that is that he had business that he was doing in Aberdeen, or family that he was visiting in Aberdeen, and he sent several letters to Wilhemina saying, "Oh, by the way, I'm in town." And they did invite him, but he'd sent a few different letters, and he kind of was extending his time there, hoping that he'd get an invitation, and he did get an invitation, and by all accounts it was an enjoyable visit. And then he goes back in the summer of 1796, and this was also something I didn't find a great, only one of my biographies mentioned that. And so I tried to do some digging, and it does look that he went a second time to visit with her, and that it was awkward. And according to what I'd read, the Burger translation, he had a friend who sent a copy of that book to Fettercarn while Walter was there. And he was a little bit embarrassed by it. And it didn't really say what Wilhelmina's reaction to it was, but I read up on what the Burger translation, Lenore, and what it's about, and I can see that perhaps a mother would not love the daughter. It's a little funky. It deals with hellfire and all that kind of stuff. So I made up the idea that her mother didn't approve of it, or didn't think her father would approve of it. But it does seem like there was a visit to Fettercarn. And then, all right. Oh, I'm sorry, I got that mixed up. William visits Fettercarn in the summer. Walter goes again in the fall. So William was invited to Fettercairn, William Forbes, and that seems to be when things turned for him and Wilhemina. They would have been have known each other back in Edinburgh, since that Forbes was involved in that same society, but this seems to be where things had changed. And so then Walter visits in September, and that's when things are kind of awkward and things are strange, which makes sense because a month later Wilhemina was engaged to William, and different accounts were stated. One said that they were in public at the time that Walter learned about the engagement, and that he was very upset, and that he said he would marry before she did. And of course that didn't happen. But I went with that because it's good dramatic effect, and it worked in my storyline. So then we have Wilhemina is engaged to William Forbes, and then we have a year that passes, and during that year, Walter is part of the cavalry brigade. He was a very good horseman, and William Forbes was part of that as well. And so we skip a year, and then Walter goes to Gisland on the advice of his friend, and his friend had said that the lake country of northern England was just as good as the lake country of Scotland. And Walter didn't believe him, but he agreed to take a holiday and go down and see the Lake District. And to my understanding, he still thought that Scotland was better than Northern England. So as I read this, at one point it says that when Charlotte left for Carlisle, she told Walter not to follow her and not to come. They would have been acquainted for a week, maybe 2 weeks, while they were in Gisland. And in Gisland, it was a resort town, and they did a lot of entertainments and things that would bring people together. And Walter would have been involved in those, and Charlotte would have been involved in those. But she ends up going to Carlisle after a week or two. She had a companion, Jane, and Jane was once her tutor, and then eventually became her companion as she got older and was out of school. There wasn't a whole lot of information on that, so I tried to pull what I could. But Jane's grandfather, was the cardinal in that area, and she had family there. And the reason they left Gisland for Carlisle was to stay with her family, the Nicholsons in Carlisle. But when she left, she told Walter, don't follow me. And so I had to come up with a reason for that. But Walter does follow her, and he presented her at one point around that same time with a letter that explained his situation, explained his hopes for the future, but it told her flat out how much money he made and his occupation and what he expected to do with things. There's quotes of it in the different biographies that I used, and to me, I looked at that and saw it as, if he felt that it was the financial situation that had created the disconnect between him and Wilhemina, he would want to make sure that Charlotte was well aware of where things were. So that was a significant event in all of that. And then Walter and Charlotte end up engaged in late September 1797. After that, he went on to northern Scotland, where he had some business that he was doing within his work as a barrister. And then he came back to Gisland, and Carlisle, and they were married there in December of 1797. So those were kind of the main points that I had to work with. And then the epilogue is several years later, and it's when he's finishing up Lady of the Lake, which was inspired by a visit to the Lake Country, and he started it then, and shortly after that trip in August of 1809, his children became very ill through the winter, and he didn't get a lot of time to work on that, finishing that poem. And so the epilogue takes place when he is finishing up that poem, and Charlotte reads it for him. My opinion of Charlotte and Walter's relationship, as I read through the different works, was that they were very much in love, but she was a very practical sort. There was a point after their engagement and before they were married, when they were writing letters back and forth, and Peter had brought this up to me when we were chatting a little bit before, but at one point she wrote him back and say, stop saying must so much. You're being over dramatic. And so I think that she was a very steadying force for him, but different than Wilhemina and different than him. I don't think that she had stars in her eyes over the fact that he was so successful with his writing. I think she was involved and supportive and those things, but I think she was a pretty practical gal, and she supported him the ways that he needed to be supported. If you have two people that are living in a fictional world, it can be a little hard to be in reality, and I think she was a pretty grounding force for him. And so then he completed Lady of the Lakes in May of 1810. So this is a basic plot structure for writing a romance novel. I've written a lot of romance novels, and this is just kind of how it works. The first opening chapter is that they meet. We do meet cute. And then you kind of set up your story, and then something happens that pulls them apart, and then other things happen where there's kind of, a crossing of lines and swords. Then you have your midpoint where it seems like everything's working out great, and then things fall apart and all is lost, and then you have the dark night. It's called the dark night of the soul, is what we call it in literary circles, and that means when everything is miserable. Everything is lost. It's never going to work. Then you have the grand gesture, which is usually done by whoever has been the biggest pain in the neck through the story. So whoever's been the hardest one is the one that has to make a grand gesture. They need to be the one that lays down at the feet and says, I'll do whatever it takes. And then you have your closing image. And so many of these points show up in the book, but I was writing 3 different people's stories and 2 specific romance stories. And so the love triangle of doom. Love triangles are extraordinarily hard to write. So this is what the plot structure looked like more within the book that I was writing. We had the meet cute at the beginning when Wilhemina and Walter meet, but she kind of sees things falling off a lot sooner than he does, and a lot more importantly than he does. So we have a midpoint of Wilhelmina's story when he thinks, okay, we've got this together, everything's going well. He visits her in Fettercairn, and then he learns that this isn't going to work, and but you can see that she has her dark of night, which is, what have I done? I've led this guy on. And then she goes up. The grand gesture is William's grand gesture, not hers. And her story ends halfway through the book. Charlotte, we had to introduce her soon enough so that readers would know she was a part of the story, and so that we would have her in place when she and Walter met. But there's not a lot that happens for Charlotte until she and Walter meet. And that kind of becomes the beginning of her story. And within the whole thing, we have Walter's story, which is the green line, which is, I'm having to find those different points of his story and how they match up within Wilhelmina's and Charlotte's. So to say it's a little more complicated to write this than it is to write that is an understatement. It was tricky, and I really needed to try hard to stay to the facts. I really didn't want to, misrepresent their story or their personalities. And yet I had little to work with, so I did my best. So then what was left over? So I wrote out the story, I kept to those significant events. Typically what I was able to do is, there would be a sentence saying William Forbes visited Wilhelmina in Fettercairn in the summer of 1796. That's what I would have. And so I created the circumstances on how that would happen and what their interactions would have been. And based on what had happened afterwards, it didn't seem difficult to assume that was a relatively significant meeting for them, because she's engaged to William a couple months later, even though she's kind of had this understanding with Walter for a few months. So I imagine that I hadn't known until I started reading the story, and I'm like, wait a minute, he's the son of a writer to the Signet, and he, he's middle class. Why is he Sir? I had to go and look that up, which, so I included that there so that if other American readers like myself who don't know the answers could find out how it was that he became Sir Walter Scott. And after I'd written the conclusion, then I went back and wrote the introduction. The introduction is to kind of explain the disclaimers that I shared with you at the beginning, which is I'm a storyteller, not a historian, and basically says, I know I'm not going to get this all 100% right, but I hope you enjoy the story anyway. And I write that after I've already written the book, because at that point I know where my weak spots are. And in this story, my weak spots specifically were Charlotte was very, very difficult because there's very little on her. In these 3 biographies, I might have a page and a half of information specifically about how Charlotte started out. And so I had to come up with a lot of things to make her story, to flesh her story out. There was just very little about her. And so that was a weak spot for me. I had to make sure I presented that and that people understood that I didn't know all the details of how it worked. And her history fluctuated very strongly within these biographies. In one said that she had immigrated with her family during the French Revolution, but when I looked into that, the dates didn't match up. It would not have worked for that to have happened. Another one said that her mother had abandoned the family for a lover in Wales, and that then her father was ill and had sent his children to stay with his friend Lord Downton in England and was planning to follow, and then died before he was able to follow. Another version of it said that after her mother left, that her father was just heartbroken and didn't want anything to do with his children, and so he shipped them off to France, or sent them from France off to England. So very widely differing accounts. One account even speculated that Charlotte ended up as a mistress to Lord Downton, and that's why she had remained unmarried, which I thought was ridiculous. Obviously, and I didn't write that part. But there was one version that said that she reconnected with her mother in her late teenage years, but she didn't live with her. And so another thing that I'd found on the internet, I had to do a lot of internet trying to see if I could find additional things about Charlotte. And one of them had said that her mother was a mistress to Lord Downton, and that. So anyway, it was really twisty. One had said that she joined the Protestant church when she first came over to England, which was probably the age 10 or 11. Another one said that she didn't join until she was 18. Some said that she was embarrassed by her French ancestry. Another said that she just kept it quiet because it was so frowned upon in England at that time, which would have been during the Napoleonic Wars. So anyway, so that was my weakest spot in writing the story with Charlotte. But I went back and I wrote the introduction, kind of warning people. And then I did my chapter notes. My chapter notes, that is where I tell what is fact and what is fiction, and why I wrote the chapter that I wrote. So almost every chapter has its own chapter notes. A couple of them are combined. But I really wanted to make sure that people knew what I was making up and what was factual. And I also listed sources that I had used so that they could learn more about their lives if they chose to. So the chapter notes, certainly not as extensive as a biography would be, but trying to explain why I chose what I chose. Oops. Okay, I guess that's the end of that was the end of it. So I wrote this book over the course of about 9 months. Which for me, I typically write 2 to 3 novels a year, and so this one took longer than others. And through the whole time I was writing it, I kept looking up flights to Edinburgh, so I thought it would be great to visit. But I was writing it between October and April. Every time I looked about coming to Edinburgh, people said, do not go to Edinburgh between October and April. Go in the summer. And so it's fun that I'm able to be here now, and I'm able to see those sites that were so significant to him and his life and who he became. And it's been a great journey for me. So that's kind of my nutshell experience, and so now I can open that up for questions for all the things I didn't answer. Oh. Thank you, very kind. Yes?
Have you been to Abbotsford and what did you think of it?
I have not been there yet. I'm going on Saturday. I'm doing the full tour. I bought the wrong train ticket, so I'm taking a train to the wrong place and then to the right place. But I'm super excited about it. I've looked at a lot of pictures. I've read up quite a bit about it, and I'm excited to see the actual places. So I'm looking forward to it very much. One thing that I thought was really interesting is I looked on the website. So in the States, dogs are not allowed most places. I don't know how it is here, but you can't take a dog to a restaurant. You can't take a dog to a grocery store. There are signs all over, no dogs allowed, and I was looking on Abbotsford and it says, "We love dogs, bring your dogs, keep them on a leash." And it said, you know, Walter, the Scott family loved their dogs. And so I giggled when he has his dog there, and he did, but I thought that was really fun and really interesting, and I have a lot of friends that would really love to hear that because they are constantly told, I mean, we have full canyons that don't allow dogs, so people can't take their dogs with them when they go on walks and hikes in certain places, and so I thought that was pretty funny. I read it out loud to my daughter because I have a sister-in-law who's an animal behaviorist. She works with our Humane Society, which is for abandoned animals, and she's always upset about the fact that she can't take her dog places. I said, well, come to Edinburgh, you can bring your dogs to Abbotsford, it'll be great. So thank you. Yeah.
Hi. Yes, my name's Harriet Smart. I was, as a novelist myself, I ended up looking at your reviews on Goodreads.
Oh gosh, good for you. I don't read by
They are
Goodreads.
great. You're great. But
Oh, that's good.
What absolutely fascinated me was that a lot of the readers were saying this was lovely because it reminded me of reading Walter Scott when I was at school. And Walter Scott is not part of, certainly, my education experience.
Oh, really?
And I wanted to know how Walter Scott was perceived in the States. Is he still part of the high school curriculum?
I believe he still is. My children are he's lumped in with classical literature, along with like Faulkner and Dickens and things like that. Different centuries, but he's kind of in that group. I was familiar with Lady of the Lakes as a teenager. I don't think I actually read the whole thing. I think I read, we call them Cliff Notes in the States, where somebody, now we call it Wikipedia. Really, that's really interesting.
Did not include Scott, and I've
interesting.
Been introduced.
And I remember us discussing Ivanhoe. I didn't read it, but I remember discussing Ivanhoe because it was considered one of the most readable works based on, you know, medieval time period. And so I've read it since, or rather I've listened to it since. Most of my reading's done by ear these days.
Well, that's completely traditional, isn't it? Because it would have been read
there you go,
in
exactly.
the family circle, so
read out loud
no need to feel
in the
guilty.
evening.
Yeah.
But I do remember discussing that as Ivanhoe, and I've been familiar with his name, but again, I wasn't, you know, if you'd have asked me 5 years ago what did Walter Scott write, I'd be like, didn't he write the screenplay for Rob Roy? But but familiar with the name. When I started writing this book, 2 of my kids were like, oh, really? Isn't he from England? And I said, well, no, he's not from England. But my other 2 kids had no idea who he was. So maybe because my oldest 2 had taken advanced literature courses, I guess.
Well, that's great to know, then.
Yeah.
I mean, that's...
That's really surprising that he's not part of yours.
My daughter has been educated in Edinburgh, and Walter Scott did not cross her horizon.
Which is crazy because he's everywhere. I mean, is that why? Is it?
Well.
Maybe it's because he's all over the place. Because he's everywhere. I got off the train station and there's these quotes on the glass. Yes. So I'm taking my pictures of the quotes, and people are bumping into me with their suitcases. But I mean, he's everywhere. I was shocked, and I was shocked to come down and see how big the monument is. I've seen pictures of the monument, but it's as big as the castle. That was amazing. So that's surprising. I would think you guys would have a whole year on his stuff.
Strange that it's not the case.
They just must assume that they're all looking into him on their own time.
Very charitable.
Yes, because that's what kids will read in their own time.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Wilhemina Berkshires died young, I understand.
Yes.
1820. Did you come across in your researches the cause of death of her so young?
I did not. I did hear that she had died, and that Walter had said, I can't remember what it was, but he was quoted as, someone had asked him, what do you think of, and he just said something that, I'm sorry for her and her family, basically. But I didn't get a good sense of what it was. I checked the dates, like with her children and things like that. It didn't seem to coincide with childbirth, and I didn't hear anything on what it was that caused her death. But yeah, she would have been, I think, 31 or 32. Yeah, so it was hard to find that information. It was interesting that Scott had, made I think of it as like a soundbite, someone holding a microphone. What do you have to say about the death of Wilhemina Belsius? Says, I'm very sorry to hear about her passing. That's kind of how it sounded. But when William Forbes died, he had a great deal more to say about that, and he'd said something to the effect of that William has always been a great friend of mine, and I will miss having him around, which I thought was very generous of him.
Were you aware that he was one of the trustees in bankruptcy?
Was he of the publishing company?
Well, I believe so. Maybe
I don't know.
Garside can confirm that.
Yes, he was.
He was?
He's a great financial
Oh, that's
so.
sad. No, I did not know that he was
It's
part
wonderful.
of it. It's wonderful.
After what had happened, as you've just
Oh,
described.
that they'd gone into partnership together. That is wonderful.
Well,
That's
not
a-
quite a partnership. It's an
Um,
arrangement.
Scott was in.
But they were still working together.
Scott was in deep water financially and became
Yeah.
insolvent, and William Forbes did as much as he could do to help him
Oh,
in
I
that
see.
situation.
I see. Well, that's very kind of him. I mean, there are only wonderful things that he said about William Forbes, and which was so interesting because he was so angry with Wilhemina. One of the accounts that I'd read had said that he would not say her name for many, many years afterwards. He would refer to her as that woman, or, but he would not. There was a couple letters where he basically, she who will not be named. So he was pretty angry and hurt by that for quite some time, and yet he didn't seem to hold any ill will towards William. They served together and interacted. I didn't realize that they had been connected through the bankruptcy. But
And,
very interesting.
In doing some research for a volume of Scott's shorter poems, it came to my attention that Scott wrote a lot of poems to Wilhemina, and she wrote them back. It was a literary relationship.
Yes.
He took it deadly seriously. She might have just seen it as a sort of a literary sort of romance,
Yeah.
really, and he might have misjudged the situation on that basis. But with Charlotte, I was talking to you beforehand, at Gillsland, he wrote a poem, a romantic poem to a young lady, but it was a different young lady than Charlotte. As far as I know, he never wrote a poem in praise of Charlotte. In fact, she was put to work transcribing his poems to send to other aristocratic ladies in the early years of their marriage. You talk about her reading The Lady of the Lake in Proof, but I just wonder if one of the advantages of that marriage is she kept out of his hair over literary activity.
I think there's something to be said with that. I can imagine her saying, "Don't put me in your book. Don't write it. Thanks for writing me this poem for Christmas. I'm going to burn it so nobody ever reads it and puts it in a book." That's kind of how she struck me. And yeah, there were letters that went back and forth between Wilhemina and Walter over those 5 years. The way I dealt with it in this book was she was very young when he first started writing her, and what 15-year-old girl isn't going to be awfully flattered by an older man showing her attention and telling her she's wonderful and writing her poetry? And so the way I handled it was that she really enjoyed that. It made her feel very worldly and grown up, and that she flirted back with him, but towards the time that they reconnect, she's going, I don't know that I feel as strongly as even I've said I feel. Because he has a letter specifically that he writes to a friend towards the end of that 5-year period of time, where he says that he'd gotten another letter from her, and it sounds like what he's done is he said, define the relationship talk. We call that the the DTR in the States. What's the DTR? Let's define this relationship. And that she wrote back something, and he says, I'm very pleased, and I feel that everything is moving in the right direction, and that my efforts have not been wasted. So to me, that sounded like he'd written her a letter prior to them meeting up again in 95, and he said, so where are we at? And she wrote back and said, we're great, we're good, and he took that to mean that they were on track for marriage, and that everything was going to be pudding and roses. And so that's kind of how I interpreted it. I didn't find anything in the things that I read that Wilhemina was any kind of, that she was trying to hurt him, or she was playing a game, or she didn't mean what she said, other than I think she was young, and it's easy to get carried away. And then when it really, she would have been 19 years old when they reconnected in 95, which means she's marital age. She at 15 she wasn't, but at 19 she can get married. And as we all know, women until just over 100 years ago, you had a lot of the times you had one choice you got to make in your entire life that you would make 100% for yourself, and that was going to be who you married. And that would, especially at that time, the early 19th century, that would be your future. So if you chose poorly, if you married the wrong guy, you're in trouble. That's going to be the rest of your life. So the way I interpreted it was that she now is 19 years old. She's getting pressure from her parents that she needs to make a match, and she needs to make a good match. She's their only child. And her father had a title that passed through maternal lines, which was very rare. But that's how he had inherited the Stuart title, was because he inherited it through, I can't remember what it was, his aunt or something like that. But so there was that option, I hope I'm getting it right, that an heir would inherit through her line, but she was the only child that her parents had. So I imagine she was getting a lot of pressure at the age of 19 to, hey, you're going to get married, this is happening, so we're on track. And once she really started thinking about that, and William Forbes, by all accounts, was a very nice, very good man and handsome, and so that's how I interpreted it and reflected it in the story.
Was William Forbes a member of the middle class or the aristocracy then?
I believe he was upper middle class. His father had a title, I believe, and he inherited that title. But his family they were bankers, a long line of bankers. They'd been in the baking for a couple of generations, and he inherited his father's banking.
I think you're missing out an N.
What? Where?
They're actually bankers.
Bankert?
Bankers.
Oh, I didn't know the difference.
Were they Forbes of Sligo?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Well, if you look out the window,
Yeah.
you'll see right across to the castle and to the Princess Street Gardens. That was due to the Forbes of Sligo family.
Was it really?
Specifically his father, who, with the philosopher David Hume, fought an action in the Court of Session and then in the House of Lords to prevent building on the south side of Princess Street.
That's why there's
And
no
that's,
buildings there.
It's a wonderful succession and
That's
legacy
really
to us
cool.
now.
Well,
Thanks
yes.
to the Forbes of Sligo.
Yes, very much. That's neat to know. Thank you for sharing that.
Anybody else? Sorry, better. I have to start that now. Any other questions before we start to draw to a close? Well, thank you, Josie.
Thank you.
You were very sort of frank about the mechanics of writing romance fiction.
Hopefully it wasn't too boring.
Although modest, a wonderful demonstration of the difficulty of getting Wilhemina and Walter
Yeah.
right at one point.
Well, and in the book that I just did on Harriet Beecher Stowe, it was the name Harriet that we ran into over and over again. She was named Harriet. Her stepmother was named Harriet after she died. Her dad married another Harriet. She had a friend named Harriet. So I had to do the same thing and call her Hattie, because there were Harriets all over the place.
Well, if it's any comfort, Scott in his manuscripts kept confusing names, and James Ballantyne was constantly putting it right and making the names consistent.
That was smart, because people get get names confused all the time.
But I mean, really, I don't think the critics and scholars have really covered this fully, and you've brought it to light and opened it up
thank you.
in the most interesting ways. I won't go on with any more praise, which you fully deserve, because we've got an official praiser lined up for you in a moment. But just if you can just move over.
Okay.
Oh, and we've got a gift, a very, very small memento.
that's very kind of
It's
you.
a volume of presidential addresses to the Scott Club.
That's really
Nice and light to take back to the States. Yeah.
I will love it, and I was really glad to have this.
Yes.
That's really
Now, just before we conclude, the events which are coming up, I'd like to draw your attention to our next event, which will be this year's joint lecture, hosted along with the English Department at Edinburgh University, to be held in the splendid and appropriate setting of the Advocates Library on Thursday the 12th of October at 5:15. It's free admission, though tickets will be required. This year's speaker will be Professor Anthony Mandel of Cardiff University, and his topic will be the relationship between Scott and Jane Austen as novelists, a timely one in view of this year being the bicentenary of Austen's death. In fact, a £10 banknote with her image was issued today, I heard on the news. We will also be awarding this year's Scott Club Essay Prize then, and with luck, through the generosity of the Faculty of Advocates, drinks will again be provided. If you want to come and haven't got a ticket, I think they are available from you, Lee, is that not correct? And one last thing, this is Fraser Elgin, who sadly died recently, and his funeral was well-attended funeral was last week. On the table, Lee has been doing a lot of work with his effects and gave a splendid oration at the funeral. And on the round table at the back of the room are some of Fraser's books and photos, which you're very free to take for yourselves as a memento for him afterwards. And finally, before we leave for canapes and wine, I'd like to call on Deirdre Shepherd to offer a vote of thanks.
Professor Garside, Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, Josi, Ms. Kilpack, on behalf of the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club, can I say how interesting this evening has been and how engaging just to find out how a storyteller works. I had never really thought of it in that kind of structural way before. I do like your emphasis on Charlotte. I think there's more to be said about Charlotte. I would just like to ask for a vote of thanks for that talk this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.